So I don't have my little card up right now, but our last class will be, what did I say it was? I have it marked down. I mean, I posted it. Um, I think the first week of May. I have it down here somewhere. Pardon me. This I should have put up, shouldn't I have? So yeah, Wednesday, May 12th. So our last class is going to be Wednesday, May 12th, and the exam is going to be due the following day. But at that point, let's make something really clear that by that last class, any key things that we need to cover in class to prepare you for the exam will have already been done by the latest the prior week, right? So that last class, we'll finish up looking at 1984 and we'll have a little bit of fun. And definitely will be, I mean, anything we would discuss would help inform you on the exam, but the meat and potatoes of issues with the exam will already be addressed. Those are the dates. I've got them. So that's important. So the exam is up. I've given you all the materials for the exam, with the exception of a little video going over the specific questions. Yeah. So you can look at that exam now and you can start working on, for example, the question dealing with Aristotle's ethics, right? And so there's two questions. One deals with the ethics and the issue of friendship, basically a comprehensive explanation of how Aristotle understands friendship, really focusing on the three types of friendship is really the center of that question. And then the second question deals with 1984. So next week, we'll start 1984. That will be our last reading for the semester. Should be fun, should be interesting, should be an interesting way also to jump off into some maybe even contemporary discussion about the strange world we seem to be living in today and some of the parallels. So 1984 presents a kind of dystopian world. The book was published in 1948. And one thing that's really odd about Orwell publishing this book of a dystopian world. First of all, let's just clarify what is a dystopia? What do we mean by a dystopian world or a dystopia? What's a utopia? What's a utopia?
The world of your dreams, I guess.
Yeah, it's a kind of perfect place where every human being is in perfect harmony with one another. There's no fundamental conflict. There is order, there is peace, there is happiness. One way to think about a utopia is a place where everyone is genuine friends. I mean, you might even say a place. Yeah, let me mute. There we go. I think that should silence it. A place where everyone is complete friends, something like that. All right, so if that's a utopia, what's a dystopia?
The opposite. Basically, imagine state or society in which there is a great suffering or injustice, typically one that is totalitarian.
Totalitarian.
Totalitarian. Okay.
What are you reading from? You just Googled that?
Yeah.
Okay, good. No, good. Yeah, a condition that of a society, which is the essence of that society, of a type of injustice. But we should say it's a form of radical injustice, typically depicted in a way in which nobody is really genuine friends. All human beings are in a kind of perpetual state of conflict. and therefore unhappy, right? That the regime under which they live creates conditions that are instead of conducing to their happiness, they do just the opposite, right? And I mean, 1984 is a wonderful novel for illustrating some of the dynamics and the techniques used to control people, right? A totalitarian regime, in a nutshell, is a regime that is concerned to comprehensively regulate and control your life, right? In which there is no freedom in any aspect of your existence to do as you would see fit, rather than what the central government has determined what's appropriate. And I mean, so one thing we'll be doing with 1984 is particularly looking at this society that's depicted in Orwell's book from the perspective of the idea that it is a totalitarian regime. And the very word totalitarianism, it has the word total in it, right? And it's a regime that's designed to comprehensively, you could say, oppress humanity and control every aspect of their existence. So therefore, total, right? And what's interesting is this word didn't really come into parlance. It didn't come in as a term of a diagnostic term to understand political regimes until the 20th century. The 20th century. The 20th century invented totalitarianism. It did not exist prior to the 20th century, right? The word that used to be used, and it's a word we're going to see in a little bit in the symposium, the old word was tyranny. Tyranny, right? And the concept of a tyranny was a regime ruled by a tyrant who was something like an autocrat or a dictator, in which all the citizens are treated as slaves, and they're at the mercy of the dictator's whims, the tyrant's whims, and whatever he wants from them, he takes because he has the authority of law, has the sovereign power over everybody else, and he rules over not citizens but subjects, right? So, for example, when you talk about the British, they're still often referred to as subjects of the British crown, right? In ancient Greece, we all saw what it meant to be a citizen, a full citizen. It didn't just mean you vote and pay taxes and go on jury duty. A citizen was one who directly participated in shaping the life of the city in a manner that they chose, a self-governance through the process of making laws. And the process of making laws involved deliberating with other citizens who obviously were of equal status and equal power to shape the way of life of their own society based on their own conception of happiness. So the kind of, I mean, there are different shades of meaning of a citizen, but in the Greek sense, a citizen is one who's completely in control and free to shape their own life. That, of course, you do it collectively, and you have to take into consideration other people's opinions. But so you deliberate, you compromise, and you reach agreement, and you pass legislation or whatever it is. A subject of a tyrant. I mean, the word subject literally means subordinate to, like beneath, sub, the prefix. So it's one who's beneath the ruler and therefore subordinate to the authority of the ruler. But even in an ancient tyranny, the tyrant wasn't concerned to regulate every aspect of your life, only ones that could be a threat to their power and their authority, right? So I'm still doing a little preface to 1984, but this is gonna spill over to some things we actually see in the symposium, right? There's some interesting claims in Pausanias's speech, which we'll jump into in just a few minutes. So in the 20th century, is the first moment where regimes tried to kind of totally control people's conduct, right? And if you think of the Soviet Union as the premier example of this, I mean, they established their totalitarian regime. The Russian Revolution happens in 1917. And by the late 20s and into the 30s, 40s, and 50s, they really establish a kind of comprehensive system of social control of people through all kinds of different techniques. But if you think of how they did it, they lacked all the fancy technologies that we have today. I mean, the internet really today sits at the center of, on one hand, our ability to freely communicate and assemble with people and kind of assert our First Amendment right of speech and assembly. We don't typically, you think of assembly, you assemble in a public square or a house or a church or what have you, or synagogue or mosque. But here we can assemble on the internet, right? And so on one hand, the internet has a vast possibility to connect people and for them to speak about things in an open and free way, or exchange information in an open and free way, and also get access to information. On the other hand, a phone or a computer is a surveillance device, and your information that you have on those devices is connected to the internet. And it's absolutely the case that virtually all your information is somewhere out there collected by either the government or things like Facebook or other forms of social media. Absolutely. And the more you look into it, the more you realize how comprehensive. We can't live our, just one last thing about this, we can't live our lives except through the internet. So we can't function, right? It's like today, if you want to do anything, you got to get a vaccine. You want to get on a plane, you got to get a vaccine. You want to go out to dinner, you got a vaccine. If you want to live in the 21st century, you've got to use the internet. And in using the internet, it's not just a communication tool, it's also a surveillance tool. And I know many people will say, well, I'm not a terrorist. I'm not doing anything bad. Why does it matter to me? Well, there are many, many stories out there of people who have committed no crimes, done nothing wrong, except perhaps maybe have the wrong opinion about things, who have suffered all kinds of consequences of it. And it's a surveillance tool, because everything, because we live our lives on the internet, it means that we have given this cloud out there, and whoever's soaking up the information, we've put more information about ourselves on the internet than any generation in human history has put information out publicly about themselves. What a government or what a corporation like Facebook or Google, what they know about humanity right now is more than any powerful institution or government has ever known about its citizens, its subjects, its people ever. I mean, it's just, it's self-evident, right? And you think about the whole idea of that thing called big data, which is like massive amounts of data about massive numbers of people. What do they do with it all? I know most people think that in taking our information, they're concerned to market to us. So we click on a link on Facebook for something, I don't know, and then we go to Amazon and we see an ad pop up for the same thing we clicked on another site, and you're wondering how that happened. But if you look at China today, China has what's called a social credit system, right? And we all know what like a financial credit system is, with your loans and your bank account and paying your bills. And if you don't pay your bills properly, if you don't keep up with your loans, you get a bad credit score. And then when you go want to get a credit card or something like that and you apply for it, you don't get it, right? If you're not on top of things. Well, in China, they have the same thing, except it's not just economic or financial, it's social. So if you are a political dissident or you're a journalist who reports on the wrong story in the wrong way, You show up at the airport and you want to get on a plane because you paid for a ticket, and you find out you can't get on that plane. And they put restrictions on people when they don't toe the party line, right? I mean, China is a communist totalitarian regime, and maybe even more powerful in its social control than the Soviet Union ever was, particularly because it has all kinds of surveillance, including control through the internet. And then you notice weird things like a company like Google, this great American company, you know, they actually went over to China to help facilitate them set up the internet, which was likely also a kind of a surveillance system for the Chinese people, right? And it's kind of stunning because China obviously has the biggest population of any country in the world. You say to yourself, how could you possibly control all those people? Well, they're all hooked in one way or the other. And of course, people even in this country, if you don't have the right political views right now, you get shut down from PayPal, or you find out that a credit card company doesn't want to do business with you anymore. I've seen story upon story for the last few years. Censorship is all over the place. If you're interested in all points of view rather than just the dominant mainstream point of view, there's been tons of censorship. Anyway, so one of the things about 1984 that's interesting is, you know, the good guys had just won World War II. The Allies, France, America, Great Britain, we had to ally with the Soviets. The good guys had beaten back the Nazis, the fascists. And yet in 1948, Orwell publishes this dark and disturbing book about a totalitarian society, and he sets it in, of all places, basically contemporary, well, England, Great Britain in, 1984, right? And you sit there scratching your head saying, why is he writing a book about portraying England, Western free country, ostensibly, as a totalitarian society? At the same time, the Soviet Union was at the peak of its powers in terms of its kind of social control. He didn't write a book about Soviet Russia. He wrote a book about his own country. Right? He was an Englishman. What is that all about? And then I think the other thing, the other aspect of 1984 is that it's a very dark, a very bleak world, and it's very obvious that they're all being oppressed, right? And I think modern tyranny or totalitarianism, if it were ever to take hold in a country, would not come in the form of obvious looking oppression. It would come in the form of something glossy that you really wanted and you thought was really cool, but then after the fact you realize was not what you thought it was, something like that. Anyway, so for next week, I'm going to have everybody read book 1 of Orwell's 1984, and I'll post the assignment by this Friday. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to just pick up one little thread in this introductory dialogue, and then we will move on with the speeches. I want to look at most of Phaedrus's speech. It's pretty short. I want to look at Pausanias's speech, virtually the whole thing. And then we'll finish with Aristophanes' speech. And if we have time to look at the juicy stuff in Alcibiades' speech, we will. But I have a feeling that these speeches are really going to take up our time. So I have this little chart up that explains some of the dynamics of these speeches in terms of who's speaking and what their real interest is in this topic of eros, because this whole text is centered around this contest. And the contest, very simply, is to praise eros. They want to make speeches in praise of Eros. But there's a very interesting little nub in this opening dialogue where Arisomachus, who's the symposiarch, he's kind of running the ritual of the symposium. It's called him the symposiarch. It's kind of like the ruler of the symposium, this drinking party, right? It's a drinking party. And he says, Phaedrus has told me that nobody has written competently on love, and that what we need are speeches and writings that give us some insight into this phenomena of eros or love. And it raises something we talked about last class that's really important, that obviously there are different facets to what eros can be or how one can think about it. But one of the central things we come to realize throughout this text is that eros is not simply a biological phenomena. It's not just a product of the genes. It's not just the pure sexual animal impulse of reproduction as a form of self-preservation, right? We realize that eros is some type of cultural phenomena, part of the creative function of language, if we can remember that produces a kind of imagined order of concepts surrounding the sexual impulse, surrounding those emotions, those feelings we call love, and they give them a more exalted meaning, right? So let me say it again. The cultural constructs around love and around our feelings and around our sexual impulse, those words that are part of the creative function of language, the imagined orders surrounding those feelings, make love something more exalted, more powerful, more extraordinary, more like, it's like a better word, special, more special than what other animals engage in. And we come to realize that the main thrust of what's being discussed in this text is love as a certain type of cultural phenomena, right? It has ideas associated with it. It has rules associated with it. And those ideas and rules and words that come with it start to shape our feelings, right? We tend to think of our feelings because they're generated in such a natural way. They're kind of just spontaneous things that we experience that are being generated by our bodies or generated by our hearts, if you want to use that metaphor, right? We come to think of them as just kind of naturally being produced by our biological self. But the reality is our feelings and what we respond to that provokes our feelings is profoundly shaped by you could say, our moral education, profoundly shaped by our habituation in a certain moral code, a certain understanding of relationships, a certain understanding of what we find beautiful and base, and so on and so forth. And, Pausanias is a very funny character, right? But he gives in terms of a kind of terrestrial vision of love, because when we get to Socrates, his vision of love is no longer love of another human being. And this seems to be why he's not interested in Alcibiades. Socrates is in love with the kind of essence of beauty. And this is a kind of intellectual love that's really a love of a certain, you could say, a concept. Plato called them forms or ideas. He's in love with the form of beauty. And it's this kind of abstraction. It not only is it not a person, but it's a kind of universal concept of beauty that all beautiful things participate in. And you say, well, what the hell is that? What is he talking about? It's really hard to get a full grasp or appreciation of the type of love Socrates engages in. And let's be clear. We said each vision of love is rooted in the nature of the speaker and their discipline. Right? So Socrates is a philosopher. Philosophy means love of wisdom, or we might also say love of knowledge. So therefore, he has an erotic desire for knowledge and understanding, right? And his entire life. I mean, this guy's weird, right? Remember, he goes out to the porch and he's standing there meditating on, and we're not talking about like Zen meditation where his mind is empty or whatever you do in Zen meditation. He's meditating in terms of cogitating. He's thinking deeply, and he's so concerned with thinking. All of the external world around him just kind of drops away, and he's off in his own space, right? And this is very odd for the other characters, but it should also be odd to us, the reader. I mean, what kind of guy does this? Like, he just abandons all his concern for his fellow guests and the invitation he's received, and so on and so forth. So he is pursuing knowledge as his understanding of eros. I mean, Aristotle says, because we are the rational animal, we all have a natural desire to know. And for Socrates, this is the most it seems to be the most intense desire he's experienced, more than sex, more than food, more than drink. And there are little more than looking pretty for other people. We discover, like, he doesn't even take showers regularly, and he normally doesn't wear sandals. So he goes around unbathed without shoes on. And what does this seem to imply? He doesn't care about all the things that an ordinary person cares about. He doesn't care about his appearance. He doesn't care for being recognized, for looking spiffy. He doesn't even be concerned to be clean. So he doesn't have all the social graces, that the basic manners that most people have. So one of the challenges is his form of love is rather hard to relate to, and it's not about other people. Other people for Socrates seem to be important to the extent that he engages in conversation with them in order to get a better grasp of the things he's trying to understand. So he uses other people as a means to understand things like the form of beauty, for example. What's interesting about Pausanias' speech is it's one of the most rich speeches about love of other people, and it spends a lot of time talking about the customs associated with love. And these customs can be express law, or they can be just kind of moral codes of conduct that we all have tacitly understood, that aren't verbally expressed in any explicit way, right? So we're going to look at Pausanias, and then we're going to conclude with Aristophanes. Okay, so let's just look at it now. See if I can find the share here. I've got too many things here. Acrobat Reader is not it. Where is my Kindle? It's right there. Okay. So here we are toward the end of the introductory dialogue. And a typical symposium has what? What kind of things happen at a typical symposium?
Lots of drinking.
Yeah, drinking, and also drinking games.
And food at the beginning of
and
the
eating.
event.
A lot of conversations.
Conversation, what else? I think two big other things.
Music.
Yeah, music. And one other thing. The elephant in the room.
Sex.
Yeah, sex, or at least some type of erotic engagement. Maybe not full blown, right? You know, intercourse or something like that. But, you know, showing physical affection in one way or the other, right? And you can see all of these things: music, sex, drinking, food, speech. Well, let's leave speech aside for a second. They all involve intense erotic desires. They all, in different people and in most people to varying degrees, they inspire intense erotic desires. I mean, we're talking about kind of like drug, sex, rock and roll. And one thing that comes to the fore is that all these objects of desire are kind of like drugs, and they all have intoxicating effects. So for example, the Greeks, and particularly Plato, wrote a lot about how music was the most direct thing that inspired emotions in the soul, especially because music has a physicality that's a little different from language, for example. It motivates the passions first and foremost. And if you think of alcohol and these other things, they also provoke a kind of intoxication, right? And what's interesting is they say, you know what, all the other drugs, the drug, sex, rock and roll, the music, we're not going to do them tonight. And speech becomes the primary vehicle for their expression of eros in the form of these speeches, right? And it suggests, number one, the erotic power of speech in the various meanings that might have, sexual and not sexual. And also, if you think of all these other elements, music, drink, food, and all these other things, they're all things that are kind of social lubricants. When they're present amongst people, they facilitate interaction, they facilitate intimacy. And so it seems here, Plato really wants to highlight the significance of speech as central to the identity of human intimacy, human comradeship, right? The thing that distinguishes us fundamentally from other animals, right? And so it's made very clear in the way they explicitly talk about how the very things that they normally do at a symposium, they're not going to do tonight. Why don't we pick up here? Could someone read for us, and you'll just start with the highlighted portion? Who'd like to read for us?
Yeah.
Eliester, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I could read, Professor.
That would be great.
Okay. I'll start. Well, Faris interrupted him. I always follow your advice, especially when you speak as a doctor. In this case, if others know what's good for them, they too will do just as you say. At that point, they all agreed not to get drunk that evening. They decided to drink only as much as pleased them. It's settled then. Well, I don't know how to say that.
Oh, Erysimachus. Erysimachus.
Erysimachus.
Yep.
We are resolved to force no one to drink more than he wants. I would like now to make a further motion. Let us dispense with the Fluger who made her entrance, let her play for herself, or where was I?
At the top, if she prefers.
Or if she prefers, for the woman in the house. Let us instead spend our evening in conversation. If you are so minded, I would like to propose a subject. Want me to continue?
Yes, please.
They all said they were quite willing and urged him to make his proposal. So Erasmus said, let me begin by citing
Euripides.
Melanope.
Right.
Sorry, I'm saying these wrong. Not mind the tale. What I am about to tell belongs to Phaedrus here, who is deeply indignant on this issue and often
indignant
on this issue and often complains to me about it. I still don't know how to say that.
Yeah, don't look at the word. Don't try to look at it phonetically. Erysimachus.
Erysimachus said, he says, isn't it an awful thing? Our poets have composed hymns in honor of just about any god you can think of, but has a single one of them given moment's thought to the God of love, ancient and powerful as he is? And for our fancy intellectuals, they have written volumes praising Heracles and other heroes as he did distinguish Prodicus. Well, perhaps that is not surprising. Well, I've actually read a book by an accomplished author who saw fit to extol who the usefulness of salt. How could how could people pay attention to such trifles and never have even once write a proper hymn to love? How could anyone ignore so great a God?
All right. Do we all agree with Phaedrus? What is Phaedrus's? So Eryximachus is parroting something that Phaedrus has told him. What is Phaedrus so indignant about? What is it? What's the problem?
So basically, people not paying or poetry or any of the arts focus on other subjects, but not love.
Yeah, good. So I think there's some interesting things in this text because Plato draws on some historical sources accurately, but he also twists them and plays with them in a very interesting way. I'm not sure this claim that, so these characters are historical figures. This is a fictional account of historical figures who actually existed. Like you can go watch a movie, you know, about, I don't know, the French Revolution or something, and you'll see the various historical figures of the French or American Revolution, and yet it's a fictional account. It's not perfectly accurate history. So this is not a history, but this is a fictionalized account of actual people. So it's written in the 4th century, beginning of the 4th century BC in ancient Greece, right? And I don't think it's accurate, ironically, that there were not important writings on the topic of love in ancient Greece, right? But what he seems to be making a point of is how significant this topic is, and that if there aren't good writings, that there need to be, that it should be a priority. Let me ask this. What do people think about that sentiment? Is it important that we have cultural artifacts like poems or novels or movies on the topic of love?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, why?
Yeah.
Yeah, why? Okay, good. I agree. Or at least that's the answer I wanted to hear. Why is it so important? Why is
Take
it?
us away from the rat race kind of thing. Like, just, you know,
Oh, come
the
on.
whole
No.
seriousness.
All right, entertainment. Something beside entertainment.
It's fulfilling.
How? Can we be more specific?
So the social creatures, we want somebody to share our lives with.
Okay, let's put it this way. I mean, how central is our feeling and impulse of love to our identity as a human being, but also our identity as individuals? How important is this issue of love? Medium important? Kind of important?
Medium.
Very.
Someone said medium? Don't read the symposium. I think a lot of people would say very, right? And not just an important, not just an important topic to like, oh, I need to know about it because I'm growing up in a world and I need to know what's going on, but important because our feelings of love and our love attachments are so absolutely central to our own identity as individuals and how we perceive and understand ourselves, right? I mean, Plato in the Symposium seems to put Eros at the very center of who we are as the most important thing. It's very interesting. Do we think it's the most important thing? I think it's the most important
I think so. I think we wouldn't exist without it, but we would end up killing each other.
Okay, good. Other people, what do you think? Is it the most important thing? This is a personal question. This text is inspiring this kind of question, right? This text not just about learning what Plato thought or something. It's about the text inspiring us to think about these issues for ourselves.
Yeah, I'd say it's the most important because nothing really has meaning if you don't really have anyone to share it with.
I say it's very important because I feel like it's a tool to survive.
Okay, good. I think all these points are relevant. Does anyone want to add their own 2 cents? Any other aspect you can think of? Why is it so important? Okay. We asked this question last week, but now it's appropriate once again for just a second. But where are we get if this is so important? So we've all established love is of central importance to our lives, central importance to our identity. Well, if it's that important, we better know something about it. Because how can we appreciate it if we don't know what it is, right? This is like Aristotle. Oh, I want to be happy, but I don't know what it means to be happy. How can I pursue my own happiness if I don't even know what it is that I should be pursuing or how I should be pursuing it? That's a problem. It's called ignorance. I need knowledge. Love in this text turns out to be a cultural phenomena, which means it's not something you can learn through your genes as much as, you know, the sexual impulse is given to us by nature, right? It's something that if it's cultural, it's not passed through the genes. It means it's something you have to learn about, right? And then the question becomes where we're going to learn it from. Where are some of the sources? We mentioned this last week, but let's kind of retread them very quickly. What are some of the sources from which we can derive knowledge about this phenomena called love, which is rather mysterious? I mean, this is one of the fascinating things about it. It's not one thing. It turns out to be many things. What are some of the sources in the real world, our own lives, that we might draw on to understand this phenomena that we've all basically just agreed is really important?
Family.
From your partners.
Family. So firsthand experiences in relationships, starting with being a child of parents, starting with observing parents and the way they carry on their relationship, including, you know, the experience you develop as a young adult and from there on out in relationships yourself and discovering things that you never could have expected when you first went into them, right? And we've talked about a little bit why. I mean, one of the problems of being educated on eros or love is that this is a very sensitive topic that people don't broadcast directly in the daylight. And actually, if they did do that, you should probably be rather wary of them. What other sources beyond our own firsthand experiences in relationships? What are the other sources?
Religion, church, culture.
Okay, good. Oh, all perfect. So, I mean, last week someone mentioned some references to the Bible in terms of how one is supposed to conduct oneself in a love relationship. I thought that was a very nice example. So, books, novels, music, poetry, film, TV, right? And so this contest they're engaged in, this is on one hand a kind of fun contest between a bunch of guys who are more and less acquainted with one another as friends, and they act in this extremely amiable way toward one another. However, it's also a contest not just between friends, but between disciplines for who has the best explanation of love. We have a couple politicians who open up the discussion, and they frame love within a context that you would expect a politician to frame it, which they raise it in relationship to moral questions, right? Then we have a doctor talk about love. So you think about the way the doctors talk about, you know, mental health and mental well-being and physical well-being, and they have their own perspective on love. And then we get to the comic and tragic poet Aristophanes and Agathon, and then we get to the philosopher. And so it raises the question of which domain of understanding, you could call it a profession, you could call it a kind of domain or perspective of understanding, which one has the best grasp of this phenomena we call love. Okay, so this seems to be really what's at stake in this, some of the things at stake in these speeches. Yeah, why don't we just, who is reading for us?
I was reading.
Yes, Eliester. You want to just keep going from where you left off?
Yeah, that sounds good. So now, Phaedrus, in my judgment, is quite right. I like, therefore, to take up a contribution, as it were, on his behalf and gratify his wish. Besides, I think this is a splendid time for all of us here to honor the god. If you agree, we could spend the whole evening in discussion, because I propose that each of us give as good as a speech in praise of love as he is capable of giving in proper order from left to right. And let us begin with Phaedrus, who is at the head of the table and is, in addition, the father of our subject.
Okay, great. And so you see something interesting here. He talks about being the father of the subject. I don't know, maybe he loves to talk about love, and his love for this topic is procreative. He gives birth to this conversation. And we'll see this little riff on procreation in Aristophanes when we get there. But so they're giving speeches in praise of love, in honor of a god. So you'll notice here, it's just important to keep in mind as you read, the name Eros, which is the name for this god that what we would call Cupid, is always translated as love. And you notice how it's translated. It's translated with a capital L, right? To indicate that we're talking about, sorry about that, that we're talking about the god here, right? And it helps to highlight the ambiguity of this phenomena, because the god is treated as a kind of anthropomorphic allegory, giving human features to this phenomena of human experience, right? But we said last class that giving a speech in praise of a god is a kind of version of a prayer, right? Or a kind of religious hymn. So we're actually in this quasi-religious context, and you can start to see some of the seriousness of the topic. And it also explains the nature of the conversation they have. In ancient Greece, when you're talking about gods, you speak about them in the form of myths. And who tells the myths? It's the poets, excuse me. So you have this kind of poetic format of myth that initiates the first speech with Phaedrus and Pausanias, and then things change a little bit. But you'll see that myth plays a very important role here. Myth being a kind of a mythological story to explain this phenomenon. Okay. Eliester, you want to keep going for us? So this is the first speech by Phaedrus. And he's a rhetorician, a rhetor, which is to say a public speaker and a politician, right? And he seems to have the concerns of a politician, because his focus becomes about moral virtue and the relationship between eros and moral virtue, right? And we're going to start to see themes that are very familiar to us coming from Aristotle. You want to take it from there, Eliester?
Yeah, sounds good. Love is a great God, wonderful in many ways to gods and men, and most marvelous of all is the way he came into being. We honor him as one of the most ancient gods, and the proof of his great age is this. The parents of love have no place in poetry or legend. According to Hesiod, the firstborn, was chaos, and then came Earth, broad-chested, a seat for all, forever safe, and love.
Okay, great.
And
Yeah, let's just, I don't know where the background noise is coming from, but it's a little bit tough. Great. So they're giving speeches what? In praise of God. So what's the first thing he says here? What's the first thing Phaedrus says?
Love is a great God.
Yeah, let's just be very simple here. Speeches in praise, speeches honoring the God. So how does he start? Very conventionally. Love is a great God. Very clear. He praises Eros. Now, what's interesting, if you turn to Socrates' speech, he doesn't always praise Eros. And he says some things that seem actually critical of Eros. Very, very interesting that it's not the same throughout all the speakers. What's the significance of that? Okay, so in explaining the significance or the greatness of this God, Phaedrus draws on a creation myth, right, of Hesiod or Hesiod. Hesiod, along with Homer, is one of the two great poets of ancient Greece. Very simple. Every speaker here is familiar with the creation story of Hesiod. For us, it would be like, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, right? And that's essentially what we're reading is the Greek version of Genesis here. So instead of in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, in the beginning, or rather first to be born was chaos. But then came earth, broad-chested, a seat for all, forever safe, and love, right? So what is the function of a creation myth? This is very interesting. The idea of a creation myth is that you can explain the essence or the identity of a thing by explaining its origins. And if you understand its origins, you understand the thing. So here he turns to, in the beginning, there was love, right? How many people are generally familiar with the first few verses of Genesis? People have a general familiarity?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So, he says, the Bible says, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. And then it talks about waters. And then it talks about like the darkness of the deep, and heaven and earth. There's a kind of like a void. So the word chaos means a kind of, it doesn't just mean anarchy and lack of structure. It means like void, right? There's nothing. So in the beginning, there's this kind of void. And then it's filled by what? It's filled by earth and love, right? Earth is broad-chested. Does anyone understand what he's talking about there? Earth is broad-chested and a seat for all. How is Earth broad-chested, right? Like broad-chested. Like someone who...
Oh, so probably it's big. It has enough space for people.
It's big. And what aspect of the Earth is it referring to?
Land?
Yeah, very good. Land. And I think like a kind of, like an image of like the surface of the Earth doing something like this that extends out broadly, as far as the eye can see, something like that. So instead of heaven and earth being, so what's the significance in the Genesis story of heaven and earth, right? The significance is heaven and earth are like the two primordial elements from which everything is made, right? And everybody knows the creation of Adam story in chapter 2, where God takes the soil from the earth or the clay or the dust from the earth, shapes it into a man. And then what does he do?
Blow into the dust.
Yeah, he blows into his nostrils and brings him to life. And what is Adam then? He's a mixture of heaven on the one hand and earth on the other, right? So, in ancient Greece, and other cultures, I mean, all cultures had a version of this, but one version the Greeks had is that everything in the universe or cosmos is comprised of four central elements. It's either earth, wind, or it's, earth, water, fire, or air, right? So in the Genesis story, you start out not with four fundamental elements like on the periodic table. You start out with two elements on the periodic table. It's heaven and earth, and everything else is comprised of that. And therefore, what is that pointing to? It's pointing to the fundamental significance of heaven and earth as being like the substrate from which everything in the world is made, right? Here, what are the two substrates? It's not heaven and earth, but what? Earth and what?
Chaos?
Whoa.
Love. Everything in the cosmos, says Phaedrus, is earth and love, right? And Eryximachus is going to pick up on this theme of love as like a cosmic force that like holds things together, right? Almost like a gravitational force that brings harmony to the world, right? So what's the significance of love being one of like the primordial elements? So here, this has nothing to do with love people, right? There are no people right now. There are gods being created. Love here is a god, right? But what's the significance of love being one of the two primordial elements of the cosmos? What does that mean? What does it suggest about love? What does it imply about love?
That it's a foundation. It's a foundation. It's a basic element.
Perfect. And since it's a foundation, therefore it's what? What else might we conclude from that?
I was gonna say it's like part of our origin.
Part of our origins.
The beginning.
Yeah, it's the very thing that inspires everything else. That's good. It's if it's here at the beginning, it means that everything else that comes out of earth and love is going to be imbued with it. It's going to be made of it. Okay, good. Cynthia says it's the greatest good. I mean, one thing being suggested here is because it's so primordial and it's part of the beginning of things, it simply suggests its significance, its importance, right? Okay. Eliester, you want to keep going?
Yeah. And Aculeus agreed with Hereward. After chaos came, earth and love, these two. And Parmenides tells Parmenides tells all of this beginning. The first God designed was love. All sides agree then love is one of the most ancient gods. As such, he gives to us the greatest good.
Okay, great. So what does Parmenides say? In the beginning, there wasn't earth and love. In the beginning, there was love, right? He seems to give it an even, so Parmenides is a philosopher, and he's just giving another version of the creation myth, where he's saying in the beginning, it wasn't earth and love, but just love, right? Again, reinforcing this foundational significance of this thing called love, right? And then Phaedrus says this, everybody agrees that love is one of the most ancient gods. And so we get into this discussion of young gods and old gods. And what is the significance? Why does it matter that love is ancient versus, say, modern, for example, or contemporary, right? So in a traditional society that respects tradition, and Greece, for the most part, was a traditional society, with some interesting complications thrown in. In a traditional society, that we talked about this going back to Mending Wall, right? He doesn't go behind his father's saying, and he respects his father's saying as good precisely because it was his father's saying, and it was probably his grandfather's saying and his great grandfather's saying. Therefore, it was good precisely because it was ancient, because it was old, because it stood the test of time, because it was at, you could say, the origins of things here, right? Okay. Has Phaedrus celebrated love enough? I mean, he's made it the most important phenomenon, not just in our lives, but in the entire cosmos, right? It's a story. All right. You want to keep going, Eliester?
Yeah, that sounds good. I cannot say what greater good there is for a young boy than a gentle lover, or for a lover than a boy to love.
Okay.
There is...
Okay, we got to stop, right? Let's go back for a second. So he's just talking, this creation story is the creation of what? Sorry about that. Creation of what?
Earth.
Not just earth, but
Love.
And what else? This is the beginning, right? In the beginning, there was chaos, and then there was earth and love. Let's put it this way. The Genesis story in Bible starts where? Where does it begin? When the Bible says in the beginning, it's the beginning of what?
A foundation, the beginning of the beginning, where it is
Inception, like creation.
The beginning of
Oh,
how much stuff?
nothingness.
Everything.
Yes. Oh, it's not complicated. When in the beginning God created heaven and earth, I mean, this is the beginning of everything, right? And if you're familiar with the book of Genesis, we start out with the 6 days of creation, and then Adam and Eve, and then they get exiled, and then gradually their descendants, after they're kicked out of the garden, they go on to start civilization, and things start to unfold in a historical manner down through the ages, right? Now here, we've started out, this is like the first day of creation. In the beginning, there was love. And then notice the very next thing he says. He says, I cannot say what greater good there is for a young boy than a gentle lover, or for a lover than a boy to love. You know, he's telling a myth right now. And this is still part of his myth. Anything odd about that? If he's telling a creation myth?
Yes, he's shaping it to what he wants you to hear, what he wants you to agree with.
Okay, good. So first of all, if you think of all myths, they're really designed to shape your perspective in the way that they want you to understand the world. So in that sense, he's doing nothing that other myths don't do. Do you find this statement about boys with an older lover? Do we find this kind of like a non sequitur? Like it kind of comes out of nowhere without any logical attachment to the previous statement? Does anything he say actually anticipate this relationship between a boy and an older man?
No, he jumps right into it.
No, he jumps right into it, and there's no kind of transition at all, right? And it's very abrupt, and it becomes very noticeable. And so, I mean, he said it. I mean, he's clearly advocating for this. Not only is he interested in the topic of love, but he has a specific concern for this specific type of relationship between an older man and a younger boy. Any reason why that is? Is he talking about this for relationship from the objective point of view of scientists?
No, he's talking about it from his perspective, what he wants, what he desires.
Yeah. Yeah. So what is his relationship with this relationship that he's described? It's what he wants, right? I mean, it's what he's advocating for. He's not merely describing the creation or some such, or describing love. He's describing what he wants, right? What do we think? Yes, no, maybe?
I'd agree with that.
Okay. We'll see where it goes from there. All right. You want to keep going, Eliester?
Yeah, okay. And nothing imparts this guidance, not high kinship, not public honor, not wealth.
I'm sorry. Could we start from the there is a certain guidance?
Yeah. There is a certain guidance each person needs for his whole life is he to live well, and nothing imparts this guidance, not high kinship, not public honor, not wealth. Nothing imparts this guidance as well as love. What guidance do I mean? I mean a sense of shame at acting shamefully and the sense of pride in acting well. Without these, nothing fine or great can be accomplished in public or in private.
Okay. So let's go back to this first sentence you read. There is a certain guidance each person needs for their whole life if he or she is to live well. So the central theme underlying his concern for love is living well. Eros is a means to living well. It's not an end in itself, despite the fact that he wanted to praise it so highly. Remember, Aristotle says that an end is superior to a means because an end is the thing you actually want and the means is just what you use to get it. And therefore the end is superior. You know, what is another expression for living well or to live well? What's a synonym?
Living like excellence.
I agree. What's the word
virtue.
that Aristotle would use?
Virtuously?
Could be. We'll have to see the details. That's what Aristotle says. Absolutely. Oh, come on. What's the generic word that is
Happiness?
Yes. We're talking about happiness here, right? Well, let's just take this statement at face value. There's a certain guidance that human beings need in order to be happy. Let's translate that sentence. True or false?
True.
Yeah, true. And for the reason that we live voluntary existence, and what we need to know is not given to us through our DNA. We need knowledge. We need understanding. We need experience that gives us knowledge. Correct? And therefore, we need guidance. We want to be happy. So, I mean, this was the question. We all know we want to be happy, but what is it and how do we achieve it? Which is to say, we need guidance. Where does Phaedrus say this guidance comes from?
He says it comes from like love, like from like being in love and like from not taking wrongful actions in love.
Okay,
like
good. So he's going to put a finer point on it, but let's be clear. His initial claim is that love and what it inspires us to do provides us guidance on how to be happy, right?
Yeah.
Do we think that's true? I mean, these guys, it's a fictive speech, but there's some serious things being said here. Do we think this is true or false, what he's saying?
I wouldn't have like 3 years ago, but yeah, I believe it's true.
Yeah,
but when I was younger, no.
And you know, in this speech, he focuses on love of another human being, but we could be talking about other types of love. And I mean, what does love for some object of desire do? It guides our actions toward what we think is going to make us happy, right? So I think what he's saying it may not be the love of another person, or it may not be the specific love he describes, right? Remember, this is his opinion. And you see the kind of the stamp of his personality and his own desires coming through in this speech. The reason the speeches are different is because these characters are different and they have different desires, and therefore they have different understandings of eros, right? So then he says, what imparts the guidance? And then you might be surprised by what he says. You might not be expecting this. He says, what I mean is the sense of shame at acting shamefully, and a sense of pride at acting well. Without these, nothing fine can be, or great can be accomplished in public or private, right? So the public sphere is the political sphere, and the private sphere is what you do, you know, in your home, right? So what's the model he's going to set up? That when you're with your beloved, whoever, the person you love is the person whom you respect their opinion. And in particular, you respect their opinion of you, and you want to be seen well in their eyes. So when you do something that they don't like, and they say, and they disapprove of it, it makes you feel shame. And when you do something that they admire, they respond positively, and it makes you feel pride, right? And therefore you do the things that are going to get a positive response, get praised rather than blamed, right? I mean, Aristotle has this same model in the Nicomachean Ethics, that kind of society is a stage where we perform actions, and the rest of society, particularly our friends and our loved ones, are our audience. And when we act, they judge us well or poorly. And of course, since we love them, or we're good friends with them, and we care about their opinion, and therefore when they judge us negatively, it matters as much as when they judge us positively, and maybe even more so when they judge us negatively. I think I gave the example, you know, how much do you care about other people's opinion? And some people said, well, I do what I want to do. But if your husband or wife, your parents, and all your friends and your dog, if they all look down on you in shame, you'd probably think you're doing something wrong, and you'd probably be right. Does anyone remember what love is going to inspire people to do specifically in this speech? It's maybe not what you're expecting at first.
Isn't it the lady that's sacrifices herself?
Yeah,
for Asmut something? Asmadut?
There's Alcest. There's a couple different characters that he talks about. So, but you're right. You're right.
I think that's like the best point he makes too. I think love, like that one reason that it makes people do things that no other thing can make them do, is like his greatest argument.
Extraordinary things. Does anyone remember what virtue does love inspire? Right. So let's put this in play now. You know, living well or happiness is living virtuously. Phaedrus is saying that love inspires us, or it provides guidance in order to be happy, right? He's going to go on and say that love inspires a specific moral virtue that Aristotle, I mean, we didn't look at all the moral virtues, but he talks about, and it's one of the 4 cardinal virtues in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. What moral virtue does love inspire that Phaedrus is concerned with?
Courage.
Yes, absolutely. Courage. And what is courage again? What exactly is the virtue of courage? What does it involve? What does it allow us to do?
To be brave.
Yeah, so bravery is a kind of synonym. What is it? Can anyone give a definition of courage? Okay. It's
against all odds that you would let's encourage like when you have bravery, like even when like you're afraid, you're still gonna do it. Like,
okay, good. So that's that. Now we're getting a definition. So courage is something like the the state of mind that gives you the ability to act for something that you know is right, despite the fear or the threat of negative consequences, right? And of course, the ultimate negative consequence is death. So courage allows you to act in the face of fear on behalf of what you know is right or what you think is right, right? So here we're going to act on behalf of our loved one, and we're going to act courageously in the face of what? In the face of death, right? And you can start to see why Phaedrus picks this theme. He's a politician, so he's talking about the value of love inspiring courage. Particularly, he talks about warriors in battle, right? Okay, let's keep reading. Elias, do you want to keep going?
Yeah. What I say is this: if a man is in love, is found doing something shameful or accepting shameful treatment because he is a coward and makes no defense, then nothing would give him more pain than being seen by the boy he loves, not even being seen by his father or his comrades. We see the same thing also in the boys he loves, that he is especially shamed before his lover when he is caught in something shameful. If only there was a way to start a city or an army made up of lovers and the boys they love. Theirs would be the best possible system of society, for they would hold from all of that is shameful and seek honor in each other's eyes.
Okay, so
even a few of them.
Let's just pause just a second. He talks about the best possible system of society in which everybody's lovers and they all do the right thing because they're seeing themselves through their lover's eyes, and they have the deep desire to do the right thing and not be ashamed, publicly shamed by their lover, right? So he talks about shame on the one hand and pride on the other, right? And shame and pride are the rewards and punishments of their actions, right? So I can't remember who said it. It's probably Plato or Aristotle said something like pain and pleasure are the two great masters that dictate human conduct, right? So when we act, if our action is good, we get rewarded. And if our action is bad, we get punished. Here we get rewarded with a sense of pride because we're admired by our lover, and we get punished by a sense of shame because our lover's looking down at us for not living up to their expectations of us, right? And of course, when we feel pride, we feel pleasure. And what is pleasure going to do? It's going to motivate us to do the action. And when we feel shame, we're going to feel pain, psychological pain, and it's going to deter us from, the action that they don't admire, right? So you think of this basic use of pleasure and pain to guide someone's actions, but not in the form of parents, telling their children what to do, but lovers seeing one another through each other's eyes. Okay. Is that description accurate? Does this hold sway over our actions in real life? We don't want to be seen negatively in the eyes of the person we love. Does this motivate us to do the right thing?
Yes, it does.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, because you don't want your wife or husband on your back all day. It's like, come on, give me a break. So I'll take out the trash so I don't have to, hear about it, right? Stuff like that. That's a tacky example. Yeah, so it's fascinating. We really can see what Phaedrus, at least parts of what Phaedrus is saying, is quite an accurate description, at least of certain facets of relationships. You want to keep going, Eliester?
Yeah. If there were a way to start a city or an army made up of lovers and the boys they love, theirs would be the best possible system of society, for they would hold back from all that is shameful and seek honor in each other's eyes. Even a few of them in battle, side by side, would conquer all of the world. I'd say, for a man in love would never allow his loved one of all people to see him leaving rings or dropping weapons. He'd rather die 1,000 deaths. And as for leaving the boy behind or not coming in his aid in danger, why? Why? No one isn't so base that true love could not inspire him with courage and make him as brave as he'd been born a hero. When Homer says a god breathes might into some of the heroes, that is really love's gift to every lover. Besides, no one will die for you but a lover, and a lover will do the same even if she's a woman. Our sister,
Go for it.
Our sister is proof to everyone in Greece that what I say is true. Only she was willing to die in place of her husband, although his father and mother were still alive. Because of her love, she went so far beyond his parents in family feeling that she made them look like outsiders as if they belonged to their son in name only. And when she did this, her deed struck everyone, even the gods, as noble done. The gods were so delighted, in fact, that they gave her the prize they deserve. They reserved for a handful chosen for the throngs of noble heroes. They sent her soul back from the dead. As you can see, the eager courage of love wins the highest honor from the gods.
Okay, great. So, I mean, he makes some interesting observation that love unites people and inspires them and makes possible courageous and extraordinary deeds. It turns people into heroes, right? And there's some important truth to that. And this sense of unity makes people very strong and powerful. And this theme is going to become really important when we look at some of the things Pausanias says, particularly when he talks about the tyranny in Persia, in which they use a divide and conquer strategy to control people. And one thing they prevent them to do, they prevent them from having love relationships, and it makes them weak and divided. Then, for example, in Aristophanes' speech, he talks about how the human beings got too much power and Zeus he felt threatened by the power that the human beings had. So does anyone remember what Zeus does to those strange looking spherical human beings in Aristophanes' speech when he feels threatened that they've got too much power?
Cut them in half.
Yeah, he cuts them in half. And obviously this is like a kind of cute mythical description, but it's really a metaphor for a kind of divide and conquer strategy, right? When people are united, they are strong. And when they are divided, they are weak, right? Look at our society, the media and politicians of all stripes constantly dividing us along lines of race, gender, class, sex, orientation, and on and on and on and on and on. And you really start to wonder whether they're just, when they talk about these things, whether they're reflecting the realities of society as an observation, or whether actually they're trying to promote division between people. Because I think the real problems in our society are probably not the person next to you. They're the person who's more powerful, who's above you. And they seem to have a kind of diversionary tactic. And the tactic they use is the same one Zeus uses, is the same one the Persians use, and is the same thing that's going to be described in 1984. Okay, so just a couple little interesting notes here. He explains the principle of love, how it inspires courage, how it inspires loyalty to one another and commitment to act. And then he gives two examples. And the first one is Alcestis, a woman, a mythological character, but a woman. And she is the paragon of love and courage. And then he gives another example down here of Orpheus, a man. And what does he say? He said Orpheus was a coward. Orpheus was not willing to act courageously, and because he didn't properly love. So it's interesting that a female gets celebrated here and the male gets demoted. And then he just gives a variety of different examples that have a lot of interesting nuances, but We should move on here. So we've got a clear idea of what Pausanias is talking about, excuse me, what Phaedrus is talking about. So let's move on to Pausanias. Burning a ship home also makes heroes. What do you mean?
Like, you know how you were saying like love could inspire courage? Like, you know, I remember reading like, I believe it was like the Persians earlier, and then the Greeks, they would burn their ships. Like so then there would be no other option but to like win the battle.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so they talk about cowards like, you know, running and leaving their weapons behind and things like that. Yeah, so you put them in a position where they have no choice but to be courageous. Yeah, that's true of most militaries. Like, you know, the people who in World War I who didn't come out of the trench and charge in no man's land, or the people in Civil War who didn't charge, very often they got shot for not obeying their orders, because that's the way you motivate people. And ironically, that's not so much love. And of course, what Phaedrus says is a bit, it's a bit utopian, right? You're not going to find an army where everybody loves one another and is so committed. But of course, the goal, it would seem to be, is to create that kind of camaraderie, to create those bonds so that people are willing to die for one another. And you would think, in being actually willing to die for one another, they might have a much better chance of staying alive, ironically, because they're really committed to one another. And also, I mean, it's something you might not consider. And I think I remember reading this on the Amtrak train one time, and a guy who was in the military saw it and we started having conversation. But I mean, he is talking about the military world there. And the one thing that's fascinating for most of us civilians, I've never served in the military, is the intense camaraderie and comradeship that's brought about in the military, precisely because the threat of death is actually very real. And it brings those people together, brings soldiers together in a way that is not, it doesn't happen in ordinary relationships, because you don't have this kind of extreme crucible of of war. And of course, it starts with their training, because of course they're not just training for anything, they're training to go into battle with the threat of death. So this mentality has to be instilled in that starting with that training. It's interesting. Could I have another volunteer? Eliester, lovely job reading. Could I have another volunteer read Pausanias? Is there someone who's dying to read?
I will read.
Deshauna, why don't you go for it? Thank you.
Phaedrus Pausanias began. I'm not quite sure our subject has been well defined. Our charge has been simple, to speak in praise of love. This would have been fine if love himself were simple, too. But as a matter of fact, there are two kinds of love. In view of this, it might be better to begin by making clear which kind of love we are to praise. Let me therefore try to put our discussion back on the right track and explain which kind of love ought to be praised. Then I shall give the praise he deserves as the God he is.
Okay, great. So Pausanias has to one-up Phaedrus. And the way he does it is say, oh, Phaedrus, that was a great speech. The only problem is you got something wrong, and I'm going to tell you what you got wrong and correct you, right? So he kind of puts him down even in a way. So he says, your speech would be fine if love were simple, but it turns out that love is not simple. What does he mean when he says simple? When we normally think of simple, we think of like it's easy, but that's not really what he means.
Maybe he's trying to say there are different forms of love.
Yeah, so it's not
one kind.
It's not absolutely. That's not one type. I mean, it turns out that there's two, but there could actually be very many more. And every speech we get a different vision of love. So there's not even just two. There's as many forms of love, maybe even as there are people, right? All these characters have a slightly different vision of love based on who they are. So if we took took the survey of everybody would have a slightly unique vision. So what's the antonym to simple here?
It's complex.
Yes, complex, multifaceted, right? And so this is really important. It raises the question of why love is complex, or we might even say complicated. Why is love complex? Here we're talking about love between human beings, something we can relate to pretty easily.
Because people have different views of what is love.
Okay, number one, there are as many views as love as there are people. What else? Let's put it this way. If we're talking about love between people, love is a product of human nature, right? If love is complex, it's because what? What else is also complex that makes love complex?
People are complex.
Yeah, people are complex. Human nature is complex. Our psychology is complex. We don't desire one type of thing. We desire a variety of types of things. And our own understanding of what we really want is not clear. It's complicated because we have multiple sources of motivation that pull us in different directions. Think of our discussion of the three parts of the soul: appetite, spirit, and reason. Like right there, you've got three sources of motivation that generate three different types of desires toward different things in the world. And all these things are mixed inside of us and not perfectly reconciled or synthesized. There's a conflict there. Okay, so this idea of love being complex rather than simple is really important. I'll tell you one more reason it's complex is that love is not simply a genetic disposition. If it were just our DNA, love would be as simple as reproduction, procreation, right? That's pretty cut and dried. But the reality is love is also a product of culture, and culture has a set of rules and customs and habits, and it changes from one place to the next, right? So therefore it's really complex because just like in each individual, it's a little different. In each society, there's a different general kind of base understanding of what constitutes the phenomena. Okay, so just here, the theme of complexity is raised, and that's a really crucial theme. You want to keep going, Tashana?
Yes. It is a well-known fact that love and Aphrodite are inseparable. If therefore Aphrodite were a single goddess, there could also be a single love. But since there are actually two goddesses of that name, there also are two kinds of love.
Okay. So let's just be clear. Aphrodite, who is she? She's a goddess, right?
Yeah.
So again, he tells a version of an origin myth about Eros, right? What's the relationship between Aphrodite? I know it says love here, but really it's more convenient to talk about Eros because we're talking about the god Eros here, as opposed to he's going to get to the human phenomena, the emotional experience or attachment of love. But here he's talking about mythology. He's talking about Eros and Aphrodite. Who is Aphrodite? Does anyone know? In Roman, she's in the Roman. In the Roman pantheon, she's Venus.
Yes.
Same goddess, different name.
She's Hephaestus's wife, right? Hephaestus, the smith.
Yeah, Hephaestus's wife. Yeah, so she's the goddess of love and beauty. The goddess of love and beauty. What's her relationship with Eros or Cupid? We think of Venus and Cupid, right? That's what we're talking about here. Yeah, Eros is her son, which is to say she is the progenitor of Eros. She gives birth to him. The goddess of love and beauty gives birth to a son who is love, right? And we discover that there are two Aphrodites and they produce two different Eroses or Erotes, right? So each Aphrodite gives birth to a different type of Eros. Important. Okay, you want to keep going, Tashana?
Yes, I don't expect you'll disagree with me about the two goddesses. Will you? One is an older deity, the motherless daughter of Uranus, the god of heaven. She is known as a Urania or heavenly Aphrodite. The other goddess is.
Oh.
The other goddess is younger, the daughter of Zeus and Dione.
Mm-hmm.
Her name is hold on, I had to tell my son be quiet.
Sure.
Her name is Pandemos or common Aphrodite. It follows, therefore, that there is a common as well as a heavenly love, depending on which goddess is love's partner.
Okay, so she gives Pausanias gives two little creation myths of Eros, and the two different myths generate two different erotes. One is common love or common eros or pandemos, and the other is heavenly love. Question: what is he talking about here when he makes this distinction between heavenly love and common love? What is he getting at here? He's going to go on to explain it.
Heavenly love, the highest, the one that all individuals should be aiming for, and common love is like,
yeah, let's absolutely. Heavenly love he describes as the highest form of love, right? What does it actually consist of? Or what do you think it consists of? Anyone want to help Sophia out? What does it consist of? I think I'm going to
love.
Heavenly love consists of what?
Good morals? Good.
Yeah, it's a love that produces virtue, right? A love that produces virtue. The common love, and what does he call it? Pandemos. Pandemos, pan means all, and demos means the people. So common love is the love that most people experience, and it's not love that produces virtue, right? Remember, in Phaedrus's speech, he says, love guides one's actions toward happiness, and it produces moral virtue, and happiness is living virtuously. So love helps us to live virtuously. It provides guidance, right? So here, Pausanias is going to say some of the same things, but he's going to do it within the context of these two types of love. And he's going to say that heavenly love is the proper, correct type of love. It's not pandemos. It's not the love of everybody. Only excellent people show it. He's a bit of a snob, right? And it's going to produce virtue. Does anyone remember what virtue it's supposed to produce?
Wisdom.
Yes, so it's not courage, but it's wisdom. And so the interesting thing is in the Greek kind of hierarchy of the virtues, the four cardinal virtues, why is this on a doing that? There we go. The four cardinal virtues are wisdom, justice, moderation, and courage, right? That's four. And wisdom is kind of always understood as the highest of these four virtues, right? So we move from courage, which is sometimes understood as a more lowly virtue, to wisdom, which is understood as a higher one. So we've kind of stepped up, and he's kind of demonstrating how his speech, his understanding is superior to Phaedrus's. All right, so that's the heavenly love. What's the common love all about? What does it produce? Or what does it involve?
Common love is mostly based on like attraction.
Yeah, I think you understand it, but what kind of attraction are we talking about?
Physical.
Absolutely. So let's be really clear. The common love is animal sexual attraction that results in sex and procreation, right? So the common love seems to be like love of bodies and physical sensuality. And the heavenly love seems to be like love of the soul and something that results in what to say wisdom is a virtue, or virtue is an excellence, right? Wisdom is a virtue of the soul, not the body. It's something that is an attribute of our soul, right? So one is a soulful love about you could say our spirit or our character, and the other is sexual desire. So let's just go back a second and look at something he says. It's very interesting in the way these two erotes were created. That's the plural of eros, erote. He says, I guess it's the top of this page. This is a little squish now. He says the older deity is motherless, the daughter of Uranus. So the story, what he's doing here is drawing on different creation myths about Aphrodite. And there are multiple stories, and he takes two of them. And the one story is that she was the daughter of Zeus and Dione, which is to say what? Zeus and Dione got together and did what? Thank you, Jim. They had sex. And in having sex to produce Aphrodite, what did they produce? They produced a goddess who ultimately produced common eros that's about sex. So you can actually see in the creation myth the way these two are created. You can see their attributes. Whereas heavenly Aphrodite was not produced through sexual reproduction, not produced through sex, from Uranus. And I don't remember the story in detail, but probably well, you know what? I think the story is, I think the story is that Uranus was punished and he had his testicles cut and they were thrown into the ocean. I know this sounds crazy. You can look it up. They were thrown into the ocean and his testicles become like seeds and produce Aphrodite. And the name, this is the funniest thing, the name Aphrodite means foam arisen, or like arisen from the foam, which is to say she's born from the sea foam. You know, like salt water, when it swishes back and forth and the waves crash, it produces foam, right? New York, everybody should go to the beach. So she's not created through sexual reproduction. Therefore, the eros that she gives birth to is not about sex, right? So one is old, he says heavenly is old, and one is young, right? The common love. Now, why does he call heavenly love old? Because in this vision of a tradition, that which is most ancient is best. So he's saying the heavenly love is best, and therefore it's old. The other one is newer, and therefore it's not superior. So we reverse the whole temporal thing. For us, what's the latest thing is the best, the newest is the best, and the oldest thing is the worst, because that's the thing we're progressing away from, right? So, question, historically, good, yeah. Historically, which one comes first? Does sexual love come first, or does heavenly love come first in the actual history of the human species?
I think sexual.
And why is that? I totally agree. Why is that?
Are you talking about from the beginning with Adam and Eve?
Well, I mean, let's take like an evolutionary perspective. Which comes first?
They just wanted to have sex to produce or reproduce or produce.
Yeah, so our ancestors, right? They were animals like all the other higher mammals, and they just engage in sex as part of procreation, and it's part of animal instincts. It's built into our genes. And the heavenly love is a product of what? Not just genes, but what? If heavenly love is about wisdom and about how one acts in accord with the rules and the conventions of society, so sexual love has to come first. And then, I mean, heavenly love is a product of culture, right? It's a product of one of the themes that he constantly harps on in this speech when he talks about heavenly love is customs, the customs of love, our customs surrounding love, customs, right? The Greek word for custom is nomoi or nomos. It means either law or custom. And laws and customs are artificial things made as a product of culture and society, right? So if we're looking at like the history of the human species from an evolutionary perspective, obviously the sexual impulse came first, pandemos, and then developed over tens of thousands of years the customs surrounding love to generate and produce heavenly love, right? And so what's the important thing here? We as human beings, Aristotle saw us, and it's still commonplace today to think of us this way. We have a first nature and a second nature. Our first nature is biology and its impulses and our genes, and our second nature is what's given to us by nurture, right? The difference between nature and nurture. Everybody's familiar with that distinction. So the sexual desire is by nature, but the heavenly love is something that comes with nurture and habit and the rules of society and the taboos surrounding love and our desires, right? And what those rules do is start to shape our desires in a certain way. You might even say to tame and develop, or the word that Freud uses is to sublimate, right? For Freud, to sublimate a desire was to take a raw desire that was not necessarily respected and to transform it in and give it an outlet in society that was considered respectable, right? Okay, Tashani, you want to keep going?
Yes. And although, of course, all the gods must be praised, we must still make an effort to keep these two gods apart. The reason for this applies in the same way to every type of action. Considered in itself, no action is either good or bad, honorable or shameful. Take, for example, our own case. We had a choice between drinking, singing, or having a conversation. Now, in itself, none of these is better than any other. Now it comes out depends entirely on how it is performed. If it is done honorably and properly, it turns out to be honorable. If it's done improperly, it is a disgrace. It is disgraceful. And my point is that exactly this principle applies to being in love. Love is not in itself noble and worthy of praise. And that depends on whether the sentiments he produces in us are themselves noble.
Okay, great. So he makes an interesting point here. He says, not all love is equally good. Remember, his task was to praise Eros. And now he's separated Eros into two, and he's praising one of them and actually condemning the other, right? There, and the whole context here is a discussion of praising the god. And so this is a religious context. And he's doing something kind of impious by praising one of the gods, but not praising the other, and actually demoting the other one. And he says, not all action, he says, let me just read what he says. He says, the reason for this applies in the same way to every type of action. Considered in itself, no action is either good or bad, honorable or shameful. And he says what matters is how it's performed. So what is he saying by analogy? Love is neither good nor bad. It's how you perform the thing that makes it good or bad. And for him, heavenly love is good, but the earthly love manifest as earthly love, we could call it that too, is not good. So not all love is created equal, and not all love is good. And obviously, Pausanias is a nobleman, and when he condemns sexual desire as pandemos, right? He's actually condemning, what he's really saying is the average uneducated person sees love as sex and nothing more. But I know that what love really is something of the soul that produces virtue, right? Question. This is really important, especially as we get into the weeds of his speech going forward. What does Pausanias claim himself to engage in? Is he interested in earthly love, aka sex, or heavenly love, the love that produces virtue and wisdom? What does he claim to be involved in? What kind of love? Is he just in it for sex? What do we think? It's an important question. So Cynthia says he's just in it for sex. Is that what he actually says, though?
I think he is, but I don't think he says it, because I feel like he contradicts himself.
Oh, very good. If you think Pausanias contradicts himself, you would be absolutely right. But what is he, if he contradicts himself, what does he claim to be after?
Is that heavenly love?
Oh, yeah. Oh, come on. He's just introduced this distinction between, vulgar love, sex, right? And heavenly love that produces virtue. And he says this is good. You think he's going to say, oh, by the way, I just like sex? By setting up this distinction and celebrating heavenly love the way he does, he's going to have to claim, of course, I engage in heavenly love, and I engage in a noble form of love, right? The interesting thing is, in his speech, it starts to become clear what he's really after is sex, and that he's a kind of a hypocrite. And it's like, we all know this in relationships. We've either experienced it or we've seen other people do it, which is that if someone wants to get laid, they have to go out and present their best intentions, right? That they're caring and that they love the person. And then underneath it all they want to do is get laid, right? We're going to see with Pausanias that he presents this very moralistic and a kind of noble image of love. And then some of the things he's going to say actually contradicts the logic that he sets up. And we discover he's really, what do we call someone who pretends to be one thing but is really another, and uses the pretense of being good to get what they want? What do we call a person who's like that?
Two-Face.
Two-faced. What's a synonym for two-faced? Absolutely. Yeah, he's a hypocrite, right? And what happens at the end of this speech? Does anyone remember what happens at the end of this speech? What happens to Aristophanes? Remember, all the other characters are listening to these speeches. Anyway, he starts hiccuping. Maybe we'll find out why. You want to keep going, Tashana?
Yes. Now the common Aphrodite, love is himself truly common. As such, he strikes wherever he gets a chance. This is, of course, is the love felt by the vulgar.
Okay. Love strikes whenever it gets a chance. What is he saying? The sexual impulse arises and strikes one, all the time, right? Aristotle talked about the young and how their sexual attractions from minute to minute fluctuated, right? Because why? Because one's body is constantly producing impulses and desires. You want to keep going?
Who are attracted to women no less than to boys, to the body more than to the soul, and to the least intelligent partners, since all they are about is completing the sexual act.
Okay, so this is one of the more direct moments in this text, right? He says these vulgar people engaged in vulgar love are attached to women no less than boys. So he's not talking about sexual orientation, although this will come up with heavenly love. Heavenly love is not love between a man and a woman. It is strictly, remember, this is his version. This is his telling, right? He's not being objective. He's telling something about himself, right? So vulgar love is between men and women, between same-sex relationships, and they choose the least intelligent people because they don't care about the soul. They only care about the body. And he says all they care about is completing the sexual act. I mean, he practically says all they care about is getting off here, right? It's pretty brutal. You want to keep going, Tashana?
Whether they do it honorably or not is of no concern. That is why they do whatever comes their way, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And which one is it incidental to their purpose? For the love who moves them belongs to a much younger goddess, who through her parentage partakes of the nature, both the female and the male.
So what does he say? He says these people love something like whoever is there at the moment that they have desire for sex. Like the person that they love the most is the person who's available when they feel the impulse strike them, right? It's a pretty crude speech here.
Contrast this with the love of heavenly Aphrodite, this goddess whose descent in purely male, hence this is love is for boys.
Okay, so two things that are really important. This heavenly Aphrodite is not produced by sexual reproduction, not the result of male-female procreation, number one. Number two, she comes only from a male with no female. Therefore, this is about a love between a man and a boy, which of course, that relationship is not procreative. It does not, well, it's not procreative in the sense of producing a child. For him, he says it's procreative in the sense of producing virtue, right? So he has a kind of metaphor, a play on the concept of procreation here. And of course, who is Pausanias attracted to? Is he attracted to women?
No.
No. What is he attracted to?
Younger boys.
Exactly. So this this pederastic relationship that we mentioned last class, and that's provided a little overview in the introduction to the text. And he's now going to give a portrait of this relationship between an older man and a younger boy, at least his vision of it. You want to keep going?
Contrast this with the love of heavenly Aphrodite, this goddess whose descent is purely male, hence this love is for boys, is considerably older and therefore free from the lewdness of youth. That's why those who are inspired by her love are attracted to the male. They find pleasure in what is by nature stronger and more intelligent. But even within the group that is attracted to handsome boys, some are not moved purely by this. Heavenly love, those who do not fall in love with little boys. They prefer older ones whose cheeks are showing the first trace of a beard, a sign that they have begun to form minds of their own. I am convinced that a man who falls in love with this young man of this age is generally prepared to share everything with the one he loves. He is eager, in fact, to spend the rest of his own life with him.
Okay, so he says something really important to the issues of relationships with the issue of age. I mean, here we get a little example of some of the things Aristotle was talking about in Book 8 about relationships between unequals and their viability and some of the problems with them. So he talks about some older men who like little boys, and this is rather provocative, and some who like boys who basically are on the verge, they're on the cusp of adulthood, right? Something that we would find more acceptable, but of course he's rather vague about the precise age, right? And so he says the slightly older ones, they have the first traces of a beard and they have begun to form their own minds. Why is that significant? Let's ask a provocative question here for a second. What is it about an older person with a child that we find wrong? What's wrong with it? We have an age of consent, right? You're not supposed to, if you're an older person, you're not supposed to engage with someone intimately who's not of the age of consent. First of all, what's the age of consent? Like, what's the actual number?
18.
18, right? Or in some cases, maybe it's 21. What's the whole concept? Why is it called the age of consent? What does that mean? First of all, what is consent? I suppose in our world of all this stuff, everybody knows the concept of consent, especially being in college and stuff. It's probably the first thing you learn in like one of those lecture hall things and during orientation or something. What is consent?
Agreement?
Not really.
They're able to make their own decisions.
Agreement?
Yeah, so consent has to do with the type of decision. What is consent? What does it mean?
So okay to go ahead to do something?
Yeah, they
agreement. They make an agreement.
Yeah, they make an agreement. They give a permission. They make a judgment that they will freely that they're choosing to engage in a relationship and that they want it, or engage in intimacy, or engage in a sex act, whatever it is, right? They say, I consent, or I agree to do X, Y, and Z, right? Why is it called the age of consent? It suggests that there's an age where there is not the possibility of consent.
Because that's when you're old enough to make your own decisions.
Okay, So it's, and of course this does vary from person to person, but you know, the law has decided that 18 is the age in which you're able to make these kind of decisions. Well, what allows you to make these decisions versus not being able to make these decisions?
Having the knowledge on what you're making the decision on.
Okay, some perspective. You've gained some perspective and understanding. What else? Here, he describes a boy with the first traces of a beard as having formed his own mind. What's another way of saying having formed his own mind? Or formed a mind of his own? Yes, this would be the definition of adult, but we're trying to get at exactly what this means that allows someone to consent. Y'all gonna tell me that it's wrong to sleep with, and I would wholeheartedly agree with you, right? I mean, this is like, we know slavery is wrong. Tell me why it's wrong, right? We all know it's wrong. We all know that sleeping with someone underage is wrong. It's called pedophilia. It's like, let's not mince words. The question is, what makes it wrong? We all know it's wrong, right? What is the logic that makes it wrong?
Children's brains aren't developed fully.
Yes, they're not developed fully. And as part of that, as someone said, they don't fully understand the situation. They don't understand the implications. They don't understand the consequences. And they also don't have the development of their own reason, the development even of their own emotions. Legally speaking, they're therefore not capable of consenting, right? So think about this. Even if a child says, I consent to X, Y, and Z, the law says, no, you have not consented because a child is cognitively incapable of providing that consent because of their stage of development. They haven't formed their own mind. When they have their own mind, then they can make their own decision. But when they're young, they don't have the, so you think about these situations, this is classic where, you know, people are manipulated, right? So where Pausanias stands on this issue is rather ambiguous. And this is, you know, he turns out he's a hypocrite. The thing is, he is raising a really vital issue about consent and an explanation of precisely why it's wrong as an older person to engage with a younger person, right? And that's one element. The other thing this raises is a more basic point that we're all familiar with from our society, that love can only happen under the circumstances of free consent. You know, obviously. So, I mean, we wouldn't call it love when someone is forced into a situation to engage in something that they wouldn't otherwise do. It has to be something freely chosen. When you have a metaphorical gun to your head and act, it's not love, right? When someone is engaging in sex or even a relationship out of compulsion or out of threat or out of force, the important conclusion to be reached is it's not actually love at all, although it may appear from a distance to be it, right? And that love demands consent, right? And also understanding, right? I mean, these issues are all wrapped up in here, and they're quite important, because then he's going to go on to talk about things like deception, right? So there's one way to compel someone to do something. You have a gun to their head, but the other way to compel them to do things is to deceive them, to get them to do things they wouldn't otherwise do, right? Okay, you want to keep going, Tashana?
He certainly does not aim to deceive him. I think we finished.
Okay, so does that sound like a noble thing in heavenly love, that the last thing you would do is deceive someone?
No, you wouldn't deceive them.
Okay, good. You wouldn't deceive them. It's really basic morality here. Everybody knows that. But keep this in mind as this speech goes on and what he says. In terms of, he will go on to talk about what the lover, remember the lover is the older man, the beloved is the younger boy, and the lover is permitted, he sets up a series of rules that society has, or the rules that he wants them to have, and the lover is permitted to do certain things to win over his object of desire, right? And the question is deception one of them? Because he's just said deception is inappropriate. And I think we all go, duh, obviously we agree with that.
To take advantage of him while he is still young and inexperienced, and then after exposing him to ridicule, move quickly onto someone else. As a matter of fact, there should be a law forbidding affairs with young boys. If nothing...
Let me just say this. So this is written in the 4th century BC, the 5th and 4th century BC. Now, I think what he's saying here, we all take for granted, but it's certainly not universally recognized, the prohibition on relationships with people who are significantly young, right? It's not universally recognized, number one. Number two, not only is Plato insinuating that it's wrong, he's giving you the rationale for exactly why it's wrong. And that's really crucial. It's very easy for everyone to say injustice is wrong, slavery is wrong, yada, yada, yada. The question is, what actually makes it wrong? And that question is always the much harder to answer. You want to keep going?
As a matter of fact, there should be a law forbidding affairs with young boys. If nothing else, all this time and effort would not be wasted on such an uncertain pursuit. And what...
No. Look what he just says. Something very odd. He says this should be forbidden by law, relationships with younger boys. And why? He said it because they haven't formed their mind and they can't, he implies they can't consent. But then what does he say? You know why you shouldn't engage in it? Because it's such an uncertain pursuit and you don't know if you're going to be successful or whether it's really going to be worthwhile. That's a very different explanation than the one he's just provided.
And what is more uncertain is that whether a particular boy will eventually make something of himself, physically or mentally. Good men, of course, are willing to make a law like this for themselves, but those other lovers, the vulgar ones, need external restraint.
Okay, let's pause right here. So he's saying there's two types of older men who engage in this or pursue this type of relationship. One, he claims, is a group of people in society like himself who pursue the high road. He's pursuing this virtuous relationship that results in wisdom and educating the younger man. The other are basically dirty old men who just want sex. And he says what we need to do is make laws to prevent those dirty old men from just engaging in the sexual relationship. But it gets more interesting than that.
For just this reason, we have placed every possible legal obstacle to their seducing our own wives and daughters. These vulgar lovers are the people who have given love such a bad reputation that some have gone so far as to claim that taking any man as a lover is in itself disgraceful.
Okay, here's the kicker. Why does he want these laws forbidding relationships just based on sex? Why does he want to enforce these laws? Or why does he want to have these laws that would be enforced?
To protect his own, his wives and...
That's part of it. He says these vulgar lovers, these men who are just seeking sex, they get, notice what he says, they give love such a bad reputation. He's not really talking about love in general. He's talking about this specific relationship that he's interested in. And what is he concerned with? He's not concerned with the well-being of young people who could be on the receiving end of this relationship. He's concerned with the reputation of this type of relationship in society in general, and also the reputation of all men who engage in it. What is he really concerned with? Is he concerned with the well-being of these young boys? No. What he's concerned with is the threat that these vulgar lovers who openly acknowledge that all they want from this relationship is sex, is that they're going to give this relationship a bad name, and that other people in society are going to look at this and say, we don't want this in our society at all. We don't want this male-male with the young boy relationship at all. And why is that going to be bad for Pausanias?
Because he's a politician.
Could be, but more specifically, why is it going to be bad for him? If society decides that they don't like this relationship in general.
He won't be able to indulge in the act.
Absolutely. See, what he's saying is the people won't be able to distinguish the heavenly love from the vulgar love. So they're going to want to make laws against this relationship altogether. And how is that going to affect him? It's going to mean he won't be able to engage in it. And that's no good for him, right? So does he really care about heavenly love, or is he more concerned with just preserving the positive image of this notion of heavenly love, right? That's where we're going with this speech.
Would anyone make this claim if he weren't thinking of how hasty vulgar lovers are, and therefore how unfair to their loved ones, for nothing done properly and in accordance with our customs would ever have provoked such righteous disapproval? I should point out, however, that although the customs regarding love in most cities are simple and easy to understand, here is Athens and in Sparta as well. They are remarkably complex in places where the people are.
Great. So he's talked about the difference between these two types of love, the difference between the two types of characters pursuing one another. And then he starts talking a lot about the rules, right? And he wants rules surrounding these relationships. So whatever he may be saying in the details, one thing we realize is the centrality of customs and rules and taboos and boundaries and prohibitions around love and our desires that shape our desires, that give our desires meaning. And that is a really fundamental observation to this speech. Then he goes on to say, in our society, they're in Athens, he says, our rules are remarkably complex, right? Remember, love was complex, therefore it produces complex rules, right? Yeah, you want to keep going, Tashana? So in places where the people are
inarticulate like Eli's or what?
Oh, Boeotia.
Boeotia. Tradition straightforwardly approves taking a lover in every case. No one there, young or old, would ever consider it shameful. The reason I suspect is that being poor speakers, they want to save themselves the trouble of having to offer reasons and arguments in support of their suits.
Okay. So he talks about in Athens, the laws or the customs surrounding love are complex. In Boeotia and Elis, they're simple. And he says, why? Because in Boeotia and Elis, the people are inarticulate. They're poor speakers, and they're not interested in having to make reasons and arguments to support their suits. What is a suit here? A suit is, pursuing someone and making your case, your pursuit of them, right? What does it sound like love is like in these other places, Elis and Boeotia? What is it? What does it seem to consist of, or what is it like? Why is he talking about them being poor speakers and inarticulate? It's just a synonym for being a poor speaker. What do they do in Boeotia and Ellis? They approve a lover in every case. They approve taking a lover in every case. What kind of image of love do you get in these other city states that are not Athens and Sparta?
Vulgar. It's a vulgar type of love.
Yeah, not only is it vulgar, but it's like very animalistic. It's like free love. It's like we do whatever we want to do, right? And we don't even have the ritual of, he talks about reasons, but what we could really be saying here is they don't seem to have like courtship, right? What is courtship? No, but we live in our 21st century. Oh my goodness, with Cardi B. What is courtship all about? What does it mean to court someone?
It's basically like you're almost like dating them, but you can't have, there's no such thing as like intimacy. You can't hold hands. You can't do any of that. So it's like getting to know each other with like the purpose of hopefully maybe getting married. It's like very like traditional. It's like kind of like the old ways.
The old way. So he's going to talk about, he doesn't use this word, but he's going to go on to talk about the significance of courtship. All right.
By contrast, in the places like
we gotta talk about this.
Oh.
So what did you say it involved? Like dating, but you don't hold hands, you don't kiss, you obviously don't go with them home with them on the first night and sleep with them. What else might it involve? Okay, Cynthia, we'll go just a few more minutes here.
Getting to know the person, getting to know.
Yeah, I mean, what is courtship? It's a ritual with clear or more or less clear boundaries. I talked to my parents about what it was like for them to date in college. Oh my God, there were very clear symbolic understandings, like if you were doing this with the person, this is what the relationship meant. This is how it unfolded. And it wasn't anything particular to them. It was a generational thing. Now it's whatever, right? It's like whatever, right? But it's a kind of ritual. What old-fashioned, what's the function of the ritual of this process? What is one thing you do? He's talking about articulate and speech. What is one thing we do? We talk, and in talking, we get to know the person. We get to learn about them. What's the function of courtship? I'm talking about a very practical function, not like I'm doing it because this is what my society tells me to do or what my religion tells me to do. What's the practical function of courtship?
Is it to be modest, or like
it involves being modest
and like religion? Because it's about like depending on your religion.
Oh, come on. This is not just a cultural tick. Like some people do it because they come from a certain place. Courtship has a very practical function, and maybe our society needs to relearn it a little bit. What is the function of courtship? What is the purpose of having this slowed down period where people get to know each other and they don't just jump in bed with each other?
To see if that person really loves you versus like if they were to love you for like your body or something.
Absolutely. Yeah. What?
Genuine connection.
Pausanias is going to say you've got these suitors, people who are pursuing you, to separate the wheat from the chaff, to separate the serious person, the person who's serious about you and is concerned with you, right? Remember, complete friendship, a relationship in which the other person is genuinely concerned with you. Relationship of pleasure, one in which they just want your body, but they don't want you, right? Is a big difference. They only want part of you, which is really not the essence of who you are, right? So it's undignified. Courtship is really a kind of a mechanism to suss people out, right? Because what's the problem? Sex has big consequences, whether you're talking about diseases, but obviously the biggest one, children. I mean, this is a world where this, you know, I mean, actually they did have primitive forms of contraception, but nothing like we had today. So, I mean, if you're going to risk having a child, it better be with someone who you courted and you know well enough to feel like if they get pregnant or they get you pregnant, that they're willing to be committed to raising a child and things of that nature, right? So courtship, it's not just a kind of, oh, this is just the way we do it over here in our neck of the woods. It has an absolutely practical function, and it protects people from negative consequences, right? Or at least it has the capability to do that. I mean, you can't, there's absolute protection. So he's going to go on to talk about that in his speech. Boy, we're getting near the end here, but let's finish with this. Let's look at this next paragraph.
By contrast, in places like I have trouble with that word.
Ionia.
By contrast, in places like Ionia and almost every other part of the Persian Empire, taking a lover is always considered disgraceful. The Persian Empire is absolute. That is why it condemns love as well as philosophy and sport. It is no good for the rulers if the people they rule cherish ambitions for themselves or form strong bonds of friendship with one another. That these are precisely the effects of philosophy, sport, and especially of love is a lesson the tyrants of Athens learned directly from their own experience. Didn't their regime come to a dismal and because of this bond ununiting? Armodius and Aristogedon in love and affection.
Okay, great. So there's still much more of this speech where he starts to go through the mechanics of the courtship process between the older man and the younger boy. And he sets up a logic that at first seems very righteous, but as you read his speech and what the way people are, he thinks should act, you realize that Pausanias's primary concern is to get laid. And he's a hypocrite, and he wants to use these rules as a kind of veneer to conceal what he's really after, right? And he's rather clever about it too, but it becomes obvious to some of the other characters listening. Here we're talking, this is the last thing we'll talk about, just a couple minutes here, but here he's talking about the Persian Empire, right? Persia is not a Greek polis. Persia is not a city-state. It's not a self-governing system of citizens who govern themselves. It consists of subjects, people who are subject to the rule of the Persian emperor. They're not free. They're essentially one step above being slaves. They don't choose how they live. They don't have a say. They don't participate in their own political rule. And they're kept under the thumb of the Persian Empire. So the first thing you notice here, we've been talking about the issue of customs and love. So obviously, when we think of customs, we think of unspoken moral rules of conduct that guide our actions in relationships, right? But here he's talking about an explicitly political context. What's the relation? This is an interesting question, and it's probably one we've never think about. What's the relationship between love, the human phenomena of love, and politics, and political organization, and political power, and political rule? And that's his topic here. So we move from simply customs to laws. And he talks about the laws the Persians make forbidding certain types of activities for a certain reason, right? So let me just kind of read it again. In the Persian Empire, it's absolute. They have absolute power. They rule with an iron fist. This is a depiction of a tyranny. We talked about at the beginning of class, which is why he then references the tyrants that once ruled over Athens, right? And this is going to be really crucial to 1984, because the strategy of controlling the subjects in 1984 is derived from some of the same ideas, right? In the Persian Empire, this is why it condemns love. And the question you ask yourself, why does the Persian Empire condemn love? Any thoughts about that? Why would a political regime condemn love?
It will bring them together. It will unify people. It's a threat to the tyranny.
Okay, absolutely. So the bonds of love create loyalty between people, and the loyalty creates unity, and the unity creates strength. Strength, right? So what you have to do is divide and conquer. And when you divide people, you make them weak. And when they're weak, they can be conquered. So what does the Persian emperor have to do? Set up strategies through law to divide and conquer people. So he forbids certain activities. He says philosophy, sport, and love. And for some reason, Plato has decided that it's these three things that really bring about camaraderie between people. And you know, your familiarity with them, you can see how that might be the case. Obviously, love is going to bring that type of devotion and loyalty to one another. So people who are strong, they rule themselves rather than having rulers rule them. But people who are weak and dependent on the rulers are ruled by them, right? So you would think in the society we would want, we don't want to be ruled by a dictator. We want to be strong. We want to have solidarity with our loved ones, with our families, with our neighbors, with our communities, because the stronger they are, the more we can determine our own destiny rather than having rulers determine our own destiny. So how does this fit in with our society? Do we have a society that consists of strong bonds, where we, through our communities, we govern ourselves?
Professor, can you repeat, please?
Do we live in a society that encourages strong bonds between individuals, between families, between members of a community, that facilitate the power being in the hands of the people rather than the rulers? Jim says depends. Omar says no.
I say 50-50. They try, but really it's not the case.
Okay, they try. That's interesting. All right. So, I mean, one of the classic analyses is that a healthy society and a strong people, like the family, is the cornerstone of society, because you take care of one another. We all have, remember Aristotle's Politics, we all have needs that we cannot satisfy on our own because we're not self-sufficient. But with a family, with a household, we can actually be self-sufficient. And those people closest to us are the ones we're going to be willing to love the most. We can't love someone on the other side of the world, right? It just doesn't work. I remember some political person, commentator, he was at a talk and he said, you know, I don't care about you. He said, I don't care about you. And he wasn't intent on being cruel to the person, but what he was saying is the people I can invest my care and my resources and my time and my energy are the people close to me. You over there, I don't care about you. And he meant it both ways. He meant on the one hand, like, I can't help you out because I have to help out my immediately loved ones. But he also said, Your life is your own. I don't care what you do. As long as you're not harming me, you go and do what's best for you, and I'll do what's best for me. And I don't care if you think that's best for you. It might not be what I agree with, but you're free to do it, right? So, I mean, part of the idea of the family is that we're willing to invest our time and energy and resources in people that are super close to us. It's a product of self-love. We can't care about the guy on the other side of the moon, right? And you know, family is always seen as like the bulwark of society. Thomas Jefferson had a vision of strong households where people could provide for themselves, and therefore they weren't dependent on things like government. They weren't dependent on what we would say today, like the social safety net or welfare, that by providing for themselves and not being dependent, when you're dependent, you get ruled. And how is that? Because the powers that be say, you can't support yourself. We have what can help you, but in giving you what you need, we're going to tell you what to do. And when you can provide for yourself, you're free because you do what you want. I mean, obviously, like within the bounds of law and, you know, not killing other people and things like that. Does our society promote, and maybe you're going to think this is controversial, that the family is the cornerstone of society, but historically, it's just a fact. It's just a fact. Does our society promote family bonds? Does it promote the family? Does it encourage it?
Like I said, they try.
Well,
I feel like, I mean,
how do they try? How do they try?
Because it goes into different race and you know, for example, like in a Black community, they might not have access to certain things, and which may lead, you know, a Black male going to jail, which the mother is a single mom or something. So it varies, but it depends because on the situation. That's what I think. I mean, the ideal, of course, of the American dream is the four family, which includes the fourth member being a dog, and then the dream house. But I think society for right now, it's driven away from that. So that's just what I think.
Okay, good. Other opinions? Does our society promote the and yes, we could get into issues of different demographic groups having different realities, different circumstances, right? But what do people think? Does our society promote the family? Is it cool to have to talk? Is family like popularized? Is it respected? Is it promoted in our laws?
Can I speak?
Yeah, sure.
In my opinion, I agree with, I'm not sure who was talking before me, but I do agree that it depends on, I guess, one's ethnicity. But over here, you know, you're taught, like I said, what I typed in the chat, you're taught to be independent. Oh, you know, by 18, you should be having your own house. You should be having your own business, you know, stuff like that. Be an entrepreneur, all that stuff. Oh, you know, let's say you do have your own house or something like that. You own a business, but you're, you know, you live with your mom, but you take care of her. That's seen as like weird or something like that. So, in my opinion, today in society, no, it's not taught.
You're raising an interesting issue because what you're really talking about is slightly different conceptions of the family, right? There are more traditional so-called conceptions, which involve extended family, which involve children taking care of their parents when they get older and having a sense of obligation to them. Whereas other conceptions of the household, it's all about the immediate generation and the children, and that there's not this obligation to the older generations to support them. And that's a cultural difference, among other things. But that's a good observation. What
Another
else?
thing, according to tax, it is the stimulus check. Depending.
Good example, right? How do you incentivize behavior? You don't tax it and you give credits for it. How do you disincentivize behavior? You tax it, right? You know, like if there's a huge tax on like, you know, buying alcohol or something, it's going to discourage a certain number of people from buying alcohol, or it's going to discourage everybody from buying as much alcohol as they otherwise would, right? So for example, I mean, it could study this and find a lot more examples, but there's the child tax credit in the tax code, which is if you claim a child as your dependent, you get a tax credit. So it actually encourages children. Does it encourage them to have two parents in the household? Not necessarily. And then there's the flip side of the abortion debate. And obviously this plays into, you know, our sentiments about children and the extent to which they're valued. If you think of, I mean, this is just one element of a much larger conversation that could go on and on, but you know, the a certain streak of feminism involved in career for women, and that having a child, this is just one aspect, and there are different versions of feminism that one could subscribe to. But one of them that certainly came out of the 50s, 60s, and 70s was that the priority of women, if to be equal, is that their priority should be on a career and advancement and success, and that children, well, your body does that anyway. There's nothing special to it. There's nothing dignified in it. There's nothing special to being a mother, for example. It's just it's a role that's impressed on you by the patriarchy and so on. At least some versions of feminism certainly asserted that. And then there's the whole abortion debate, which you know, puts a certain value on human life, and so on. And then, you know, it could go on and on. But does anyone want to add anything to this, whether our society promotes the family or not?
I was gonna say, I said in the chat, child support.
Yeah, so child support's a funny thing. Does that actually promote families?
Well, that's what I was saying. Like, it doesn't.
I mean, actually, it does the opposite.
Right.
Because if you get divorced, I know it's going to sound crass to put it this way. If you get divorced, you get rewarded by getting a check, right? I know and of course, you know, some people are going to think it's more like primitive stage of existence, but our society could probably put a lot more pressure on people to stay together. Of course, coming out of like the 50s and 60s, the big theme was the dysfunctional family, and the fact that people who no longer loved one another were forced to stay together because there was so much social ostracization to getting divorced. It was things didn't happen. And like when you were aware of like being in school with a kid whose parents was divorced, it was like something that was not discussed. It was known about, but it was really like a taboo to be divorced at a certain stage in our society. And now there's almost no social stigma. I mean, it depends on the corner of culture of our culture that you're in, but generically speaking, in our popular collective culture, there's virtually no stigma to being divorced at all. You know, whether you have kids or not. And there are actually government programs that actually help facilitate, you know, not being a coherent nuclear family. And of course, the very concept of a nuclear family has been attacked. I mean, even for example, BLM on their website was claimed to be bent on undermining and deconstructing, destroying the nuclear family, because BLM is also connected with Marxist ideology, and the family they have little sympathy for it in their collective vision of society. Let's finish with this. What did slave owners do in the South to African American families who were under the yoke of slavery?
Well, I was going to bring that up. Separation, sold them separately.
Yeah, and they didn't just do it by accident. It was a systematic policy of separation, right? I'll give you some examples. So anyone read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass?
No.
Shame.
Frederick Douglass. Isn't Frederick Douglass
Middle school.
the slave that his slave owner kind of made him learn to read or something?
Yeah, he educated himself.
Helped him to read, and then he learned on his own. But yes, that's the one I'm thinking about. I mean, there's Frederick Douglass Boulevard in.
Was he like related like with Thurgood Marshall, like or he had like an influence on
Thurgood
him?
Marshall, Supreme Court Justice. In no way Frederick Douglass was going to be a Supreme Court justice. He started out as a slave, and he lived to the end of slavery. He lived, I think, into the 1870s.
No, but did they have like a connection by any chance or something? Like any?
I think you're mixing him up with Booker T. Washington. It sounds
actually,
like
you're right.
Booker T.
He made all those inventions, right?
Douglass didn't make any inventions, as far as I know. But he became a very open abolitionist and public speaker and writer. And he also became an advocate of like the early women's movement, as it was called, the suffragette movement, toward the end of the 19th century. Anyway, he describes growing up, being raised by someone other than his mother. He didn't know who his mother was. He thinks she was a woman who worked in a part of the plantation, but he was never raised to acknowledge or understand her as his mother, and she never acknowledged him as his son. And one thing he describes is family members being sold off to different slave owners once kids got of a certain age. Why did slave holders do that? Why didn't they want nuclear families of slaves on their plantations? Why did they not even allow them to recognize who their mothers and fathers were? These people grew up. It's not like they didn't have mommy and daddy around. It's like they didn't even know who their mother or father was. Can you imagine that?
They so that they wouldn't know who they were.
That's part of it. And what does that lead to?
Feeling oppressed and having an oppressed mentality. Like there's no room to get away. Like you can't even go to your own family and say, let's think of something together. Let's escape together. So it kind of separated them. That's what I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's face it. It's a divide and conquer strategy in the most intimate way to prevent the loyalties and bonds that come with family. I mean, think about what Phaedrus said. Love encourages people to be willing to die for one another. And that's true not just on the battlefield, that's true in ordinary life. I mean, I think every parent of a child would say that, they would be willing to die for the life of their child if it was a choice between them and their kid. I think most of them would say that pretty readily. Even parents who you wouldn't think are very good parents would probably say that, right? So, I mean, this was a systematic way of controlling their loyalties and preventing bonds from forming between people so that they were more easily controlled. And what it makes you realize is just how unnatural slavery is to human nature, that to keep people in this subordinate position, they don't just accept it. I mean, if you read, you can read any slave literature, but Frederick Douglass is very evocative and is just a very penetrating understanding of the psychological reality of slavery and how the slave owners had to use a whole variety of kind of psychological techniques to keep them subordinate to them. And one of them was breaking up their families. And so one last thing, I mean, this issue between love and political regime is serious. And while we don't think about it, every regime creates rules and laws and structure of society that shapes our relationships with one another in a whole variety of ways. In the Soviet Union, they cut people off from their churches, not just because Marxists were atheists, but because they didn't want people having solidarity of being brought together in social solidarity around God and common worship. They would have people inform on one another. And the best thing they would do is have people within their own family inform on each other, like children informing on parents. And so what are they literally doing by setting up that logic is setting people against themselves, and that a child's interest is found not in loving their parents, but the interest is found in ratting on their parents to the authorities, right? It's completely diabolical. And there's a wonderful movie about this phenomena of people informing on one another, set in East Germany, called The Lives of Others. The Lives of Others. It's just 2 seconds and we'll be done. It's a German film. It's in subtitles. And it's about the relationship between this man and woman, in which his girlfriend ultimately informs on him because she's basically blackmailed into it. And it's really, it's appalling what these regimes were willing to do in terms of trying to destroy the most basic and natural attachments that human beings have, and just how contrary it is to human beings' natural disposition. And you come to realize in watching these things or in reading Frederick Douglass that, I mean, human beings were just not made to live this way. And it starts to explain why these a totalitarian regime, what is really wrong with it. You know, it feels bad, it seems wrong, but what actually makes it unjust is a trickier question to answer. So next week we'll look at 1984, a society that instead of cultivating love between people, it actively cultivates, very explicitly, it cultivates hate between one another, right? We need only look at our society every day, this pitting of people against each other, groups, factions, racial groups, right? I'm not convinced that what is depicted in the media about the conflicts, it's not like there aren't injustices. That's not what I'm saying. But that I'm not convinced the depiction of the conflicts between people in the media is the same as what's actually going on, generally speaking, in our society, right? And there's something very nefarious about what they're doing, about trying to divide everybody, left, right, old, young, rich, poor, black, white. Yes, there are tensions in society. But you know, what do you see when you walk out the door every day compared to what do you see on the boob tube, right? I'm not convinced it's the same. I'd like to think better, right? But anyway, anyone want to add a last comment before we sign off here? Questions, thoughts, comments?
By this whole conversation, I wonder, and him being so contradicting, how is he like really praising the God? Because if I was a God, I would not take that.
You're talking about Pausanias?
Yes.
Oh, no. He's a total hypocrite, right?
That's why I said if I was a God, I would probably send down lightning, because he basically contradicts himself.
Yeah, and of course he disrespects the very thing he claims to respect. That's the irony. I mean, think about this character Cephalus, who he superficially appears like the most pious man in the Republic, because he's going out and making sacrifices to the gods. But then we discover that he's doing it because he's guilty of stuff he's done in his life. And actually he thinks he can make up for the guilt by spending money, because he's made money all his life, by spending money on some animals and killing them. And that will rectify all the transgressions he's made against other human beings, right? So it's totally disingenuous. Okay. So if nobody has anything else to say, we should call it quits here because it's late. Thank you everybody for hanging on, and we'll pick it up with 1984 next week.
Okay, Professor, I have a question to ask you about the homework assignment.
Yes.
The one that was due. So I'm just informing you, I just posted my assignment. It took me a very long time, but I got it done. Just letting you know.
Okay, that's fine. Yep. So Diego, anyone who showed up a little late, send me an email about attendance, and I'm going to record it that way. And Jessica, you need to chat?
Yes, please.
Okay, sure.
Okay,
And
good
thank
night.
you, Professor. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, Sophia. Good
Bye,
night,
Professor.
everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Have a great
Take
night.
care.
Bye, Professor.
Take it easy.
I also need to talk to you, Professor.
Okay, sure. So the first thing I should do is turn off the record.